The alarm on my desk did not simply beep. It screamed, and it did not stop screaming until I opened the file myself with shaking hands. My name is Nora Ellery, and I had spent 9 years studying one single question that nobody in the Concord wanted answered. Why has no empire, no fleet, no warlord, in 400 years, ever dared to strike first against the humans of Earth? I was not supposed to have that file. It arrived at 2 in the morning, sent from an address that did not exist anymore, from a man who was supposed to have died 3 decades ago. The message had one line. It said, "Ask Edgar Hail before it is too late for both of us." I had heard the name before. Edgar Hail was listed in old military records as missing, presumed lost, during a border skirmish that officially never happened. I had read that file 100 times and always assumed it was a clerical mistake. Now someone was telling me he was alive and that he was running out of time to tell me something. I did not wait for morning. I took the first transport out, and I did not tell my supervisor where I was going, because if what I already suspected was true, then telling the wrong person could get me erased from every record that ever proved I existed. Humanity is small. Humanity is young. By every measure my people use to judge strength, they should not still be here. Their ships were slower than ours for most of their history. Their weapons were behind ours for generations. Their territory sits in a quiet, unwanted corner of the galaxy that nobody ever fought over, because nobody thought it was worth fighting for. And yet, in 400 years, not one single empire has ever launched a full attack against them and lived to brag about it afterward. I used to think the answer was simple. I used to think some larger power was protecting them, some hidden alliance, some secret weapon buried under one of their oceans. That is what every textbook in the Concord teaches young analysts like me. It is a comfortable lie, and comfortable lies survive a long time because nobody wants to dig underneath them. I found Edgar Hail in a small gray building on the edge of a colony that barely had a name. He was old, so old that his skin had gone thin and pale, and his hands shook when he lifted them to greet me. But his eyes were sharp, sharper than they should have been for a man who was supposed to have been dead for 30 years. He did not waste time on greetings. He looked at me and said, "You came because you finally found the coordinates, didn't you?" I told him yes. I told him I had found 3 separate empires, 3 separate eras, 3 fleets that had all been sent toward the same quiet human system, and none of them had ever come back, and none of the official records ever explained why. He nodded slowly, like a man setting down a weight he had carried for far too long. "I was a young officer then," he said, "barely out of training. My fleet was ordered to take a human settlement on the edge of their territory. It was supposed to be simple. Humans back then had almost no defense fleet at all. Our commanders called it an easy victory, a chance to claim new resources before anyone else got there first." He stopped for a long moment, and I did not push him. I had learned by then that people who carry old secrets need silence more than questions. "We took the settlement in less than a day," he continued. "It was over before most of the humans even understood what was happening. We claimed what we wanted, and we left. My commanders called it a triumph. There were parades when we returned home. I remember thinking, at the time, that we had proven the humans were exactly as weak as everyone said they were. I asked him what happened after that. He looked at me, and for the first time since I had arrived, I saw something close to fear cross his face. "Nothing happened," he said. "That was the strange part. Weeks passed, months passed. There was no counterattack, no warning, no demand for surrender. Our fleet went back to normal duty. And then, quietly, things started disappearing." He explained that it began with supply routes. A fuel convoy vanished without a trace. Then a shipyard went dark, its workers reporting equipment failures that made no sense. Then a training base lost contact for 6 days before anyone even noticed. None of it looked like an attack. It looked like accidents, like coincidence, like bad luck stacking up one small failure at a time. "We did not connect it to the humans for almost a year," he said. "Why would we? They had no fleet capable of reaching us. They had shown no sign of anger, no message, no threat. Our leaders assumed it was a rival power testing our defenses, or simple misfortune. We increased security. It made no difference at all." I asked him when he first understood the truth. He told me about a single prisoner, a young human woman, captured near one of their damaged shipyards, caught with tools that had no business belonging to a civilian. She did not resist when they took her in. She did not ask for mercy. She simply waited, calm and quiet, until someone finally asked her the question every officer in that room was desperate to know. Who sent you? What army is coming? When will the real attack begin? She looked at them, Edgar said, and she almost seemed amused by the question. She told them there was no army coming. There was no grand fleet waiting behind some hidden border. There was only ever going to be this. One patient piece removed at a time, for as long as it took, until the people responsible for that first attack no longer had the ability to do it again. I felt something cold settle in my chest as he spoke. I had read 100 theories about human strength over the years, and none of them had ever come close to this. She told them something else, Edgar said quietly. She said her people did not measure victory the way we did. We thought in terms of battles, of fleets destroyed, of territory claimed in a single afternoon. Humans, she said, thought in terms of endings, not who wins the next fight, but whether the threat that started the fight can ever return. And if the answer was no, they were willing to spend years making sure of it, quietly, patiently, without ever risking a single major battle to do it. I asked him what happened to his fleet after that. Within 3 years, he said, the fleet that carried out that first attack no longer existed. Not because it was defeated in some great battle. There was no great battle. There was no final clash of ships that historians could point to and say, here, this is where it ended. It simply stopped functioning. Fuel never arrived. Repairs were never finished. Commanders were quietly removed from their posts by their own governments, terrified of what more contact with the humans might reveal. Piece by piece, everything that made that fleet capable of fighting again was taken apart, until there was nothing left to rebuild. And the rest of your people? I asked him. Your cities, your families, were they ever touched? He shook his head. That is the part almost nobody believes when I tell them, he said. They never touched a single home that had nothing to do with what happened. They never harmed anyone who was not connected to that first attack. It was not revenge in the way we understand revenge. It was something colder and, in a strange way, something almost fair. They wanted one thing only, a guarantee that the people who chose violence against them would never be able to choose it again. Once that guarantee was secured, they stopped completely, and they never spoke of it publicly again. I sat with that for a long moment, letting it settle into place beside everything else I had learned over the years. Why did your government never tell anyone this? I finally asked. Because we were ashamed, he said, but that was only part of it. Mostly, we were afraid. If other empires learned what humans were truly willing to do, some foolish commander somewhere might decide to test it before humanity grew strong enough that testing it became impossible. So we buried it. We built false records. We told ourselves it was an unlucky year, bad supply chains, nothing more. And when I tried to speak the truth many years later, I was told, very clearly, that my career and my safety depended on my silence. I asked him why he was breaking that silence now, after all this time. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, because I am old, and because I have heard whispers that another young commander somewhere is considering testing them again, convinced that enough time has passed for the old stories to be forgotten. I cannot stop him myself, but maybe, if the truth finally reaches the right ears, someone else can. I left that gray building with more questions than I had arrived with, but one thing had become clear to me. This was not an isolated story. Edgar's fleet was not the only one who had learned this lesson, and I needed to know how many others had learned it too, and how they had all managed to keep it hidden for so long. It took me another 4 months of quiet searching, moving carefully so that nobody above me noticed how close I was getting, before I found the second account. A retired trade official named Lucy Prendon, who had once served on a council overseeing colonial expansion for an entirely different empire, one that had never had any contact with Edgar's people at all. Her story matched his in almost every detail. A small, careless raid on the edge of human territory. No immediate response. Then, months later, a slow unraveling of the very infrastructure that had made the raid possible in the first place. No grand battle, no declaration. Just a patient, quiet erasure of every tool that Empire would have needed to try again. She told me the same phrase Edgar had used, almost word for word, as if it had been passed down deliberately between survivors who had never met each other. They do not fight to win. They fight to end it so it can never begin again. By the time I found the third account, from a soft-spoken engineer named Peter Ashcombe who had worked on a fleet from an entirely different corner of the galaxy, I no longer needed convincing. 3 separate empires, 3 separate centuries, 3 separate corners of known space, and all 3 had learned the exact same lesson in the exact same quiet, patient way. And all 3 had chosen the exact same response afterward: silence. Total, careful, deliberate silence, protected for generations by people too frightened to let the truth spread any further than it already had. I compiled everything I had gathered, every interview, every old record, every quiet confession from people who had spent decades carrying a secret they were terrified to share, and I brought it before the Concord Council myself. I expected to be dismissed. I expected to be told I had wasted years chasing folklore and frightened old men. Instead, the room went completely silent. One of the senior council members, an old woman named Grace Halloway, who had served on that council longer than I had been alive, finally spoke. She said that my research confirmed something the highest levels of the Concord had quietly suspected for a very long time, but had never had the evidence to prove. She told me that humanity's calm, cooperative behavior since joining the Concord was not weakness, and it was not gratitude for being welcomed as equals. It was patience. It was choice. They had already shown, 3 separate times, exactly what they were capable of when someone chose violence against them first, and every government that had learned that lesson had made the exact same decision afterward. Never give them a reason to remember how. I asked her what would happen now that the truth was finally out in the open. She looked at me for a long time before answering. "Nothing will happen," she said. "We will not attack them, because we now understand, better than most, precisely what that would invite. We will not warn the wider galaxy either, not officially, because doing so would only tempt some ambitious young power to test the story for themselves, exactly as Edgar feared. The safest thing any of us can do with the truth is exactly what every frightened survivor before you chose to do. Hold it carefully, and let it serve as a quiet warning to those wise enough to listen." I left that meeting with no medal, no promotion, no public recognition, for 9 years of careful, dangerous work. I did not expect one. Some truths are not meant to be celebrated. They are simply meant to be understood, carried quietly by the people who find them, passed only to those who need to hear them, before they make a mistake that can never be undone. I still think about Edgar Hail sometimes, sitting alone in that small gray building, spending 30 years of silence before finally deciding the risk of speaking was smaller than the risk of staying quiet. I think about Lucy Prendon and Peter Ashcombe, and how differently their lives might have gone if their own leaders had simply told the truth from the very beginning, instead of building elaborate lies to protect their pride. And I think, more than anything, about that calm young woman Edgar described, standing in front of officers who expected her to beg for her life, and instead telling them, without anger, without fear, exactly what was coming. Not an army, not a fleet, just patience and time, and a quiet certainty that some things, once ended properly, should never be allowed to begin again. That is the answer to the question I spent 9 years chasing. That is why no empire in 400 years has ever dared strike first against the humans of Earth. Not because anyone fears their ships, or their weapons, or their numbers, all of which remain smaller than half the powers in this galaxy. They fear something far harder to measure, and far harder to defend against. A species that does not measure victory in a single battle, but in the quiet, patient certainty that a threat, once removed, never comes back. Every government that has ever learned this truth has made exactly the same choice afterward, whispered quietly between the very few people trusted enough to hear it. Never test them, never give them a reason, and above everything else, never, ever forget why the silence exists in the first place.